Welcome to the Beau Show. The social media world got rocked this past week when a whistleblower from Facebook came forward to speak with 60 Minutes and then testified in front of congressional committees. Concurrently with this testimony, Facebook and its sister companies Instagram, the messaging app WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and Oculus all disappeared for about 5 hours on Monday, October 4th. Because I use these apps regularly, I knew something was off, but when I saw that it pervaded through all the Facebook-owned apps, I knew something had to be up. 3.5 billion people use Facebook, and this obviously affected both personal and professional communications, as well as every single influencer who likely threw a tantrum and had withdrawals. Facebook, for better or worse, has become so integrated with technology and connectivity that it serves as a hub for basic communication and information. The last glitch was in 2019 when the site was down for 24 hours. Facebook claims that this recent outage was the result of their internet infrastructure that coordinates traffic between its data centers. This outage was just the latest blow to Facebook that began when its founder, Mark Zuckerberg, and other big tech giants came under fire from Congress. Even though no revision of Section 230 of U.S. Code, which governs the internet, was made. In particular, Facebook has been known to ban particular users or groups, filter out what it subjectively considers to be misinformation, and claims to stamp out any extremism, in spite of the fact that genocide in Myanmar was coordinated through Facebook, and now Ethiopia is experiencing some similar things. Facebook's political persuasions have also come to the fore in the way that it makes certain political stories visible and others invisible. Then, of course, former Facebook product manager Frances Haugen revealed herself as a whistleblower on 60 Minutes, which I'll get to in a bit. But Section 230 of 47 U.S. Code is called a provision of the Communications Decency Act, which was written in 1996. Seems like eons ago in the internet era. Section 230 says that, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider, unquote. In other words, internet platforms are merely hosts or just platforms. They can't be held legally responsible for what is said or published on these platforms. Section 230 is a double-edged sword, because on its surface, you would think that it would be there to protect free speech, such as mine right now, which will be hosted on YouTube and other platforms. The argument would be that it doesn't censor any speech. Political and controversial speech are permitted, whereas in places like Thailand and Turkey, there are provisions that hold platforms liable for speech that might criticize the government. Neither Republicans nor Democrats are fans of Section 230, but for different reasons. Since it was drafted in 1996, you think we have evolved enough to where a modification might be needed. Donald Trump created perhaps the biggest change when he passed the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act in 2018, which reduces legal protections for online platforms. So sex trafficking and prostitution became exceptions to Section 230. No one seems to have the perfect solution to modifying or replacing Section 230. Mark Zuckerberg said in 2020 that he thinks Facebook should be regulated somewhere between a telecommunications company and a newspaper. Democrats want to fight extremism and harassment. And Republicans want platforms to be politically neutral, since platforms like Facebook can swing votes and withhold or restrict certain content. For instance, the damaging Hunter Biden stories that many were unaware of. So Section 230 is a very slippery slope because it has to balance free speech with things like hate speech, harassment, sex trafficking, child pornography, and political bias. There really isn't a magic bullet at all. In her opening statement to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Frances Haugen makes the following statement.
During my time at Facebook, I came to realize a devastating truth. Almost no one outside of Facebook knows what happens inside of Facebook. The company intentionally hides vital information from the public, from the US government, and from governments around the world.
She draws a comparison between the deleterious effects of Facebook and big tobacco, seatbelts in cars, and the opioid epidemic. Her reasons for coming forward are not just to explain how Facebook values profit over safety, but how Congress needs to act to intervene and to regulate Facebook. I think we have to break down Ms. Haugen's testimony because there could be more than one motive for her coming forward. For instance, we know that Facebook targets kids and preys upon severe mental health and insecurities. After all, Facebook's like button, while seemingly a positive reinforcement tool, breeds a psychological meter by which users might judge themselves or second guess their worth. A child's positive or negative thoughts at any given moment could be correlated with their Facebook or Instagram account. Then people started buying likes by bots that overinflate their influence. I remember at one time when I lived in Nashville trying to get a record deal, companies might not even talk to you if you didn't have a certain threshold of followers or subscribers. They used that as a metric, even if those subscribers were bought and paid for. But for a child, especially someone with perhaps an eating disorder or body dysmorphia, these platforms tend to reinforce certain images. Mind you, especially in the case of young girls, images that have been filtered and doctored to hell and back, both digitally and perhaps through plastic surgery. Particularly Instagram, with its filters, has bred a generation of dysmorphic, unrealistic people. Now, I'm the type of person who runs the other way when I see a trend or copycatting, but most, however, are not. They will just mirror the trend, as dumb as it may be. I think that Facebook and particularly Instagram have bred a generation of talentless, dysmorphic people that chase likes over quality content because the incentive is money. They can monetize their dysmorphia and in turn create more dysmorphic kids who will value appearance and aesthetics over character and intelligence. In addition, social media in general bred a generation of bullies. Facebook is more ideas or conversation driven, given the ad nauseum ability to comment to a comment. That in and of itself generates animosity, especially in a cowardly way. Admittedly, I got suckered into it many times, and while you think you may feel better about fighting back at the time, you don't really change anything, and certainly not another person's mind. So in this respect, I think Facebook became a marketplace of conflict rather than a marketplace of ideas. Free speech may have been the original aim, but this digital forum made people perhaps bolder and more belligerent than they would be face to face. Now, the second motivation for Frances Haugen would be to ensure a safer environment and more regulation of the platform, which gets into the free speech issue. She argues for more censorship, not less. She's apparently being advised by Whistleblower Aid, a legal firm that also represented the Ukraine whistleblower on Donald Trump's phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky, which led to his impeachment. The Daily Wire did some research into Haugen and found that she has donated quite a bit to Democrats, especially the Democrat Senatorial Campaign Committee, so perhaps it's no surprise that Democrat senators invited her to testify. Haugen said that her motivation to come forward was in part because a friend of hers became radicalized by misinformation, but she didn't say what kind of misinformation. It seems that a lot of Haugen's advisory and legal team are on the left or led by Democrats, but I'm not sure yet how partisan this gets in this case. The thought is that due to her far-left ties, she could have motive to push for a measure of regulation that would inevitably lead to more censorship of content, like Facebook pursued in banning Donald Trump's account. There would be a subjective ruling on what is considered inflammatory speech or misinformation that could lead to violence, and they would point directly to January 6th. But far more serious would be that Facebook might be hosting forums for terrorists to plot and recruit. It claims that it takes those down, but just as soon as one is taken down, another one goes up. Haugen released thousands of internal pages from Facebook's research that show that they knew that they were not acting in the public good. She said that this affects societies all around the world and cited the Myanmar genocide in 2019. Haugen was part of the Civic Integrity Division of Facebook and notes that there was a change in the algorithm in 2018 in which you choose the most engaging content. She argues that it's easier to inspire people to anger than other emotions. So Facebook makes more money if you engage and consume more content that makes you angry. She contends that Facebook values profit over safety, which honestly is not that much of a surprise. What company do you know that doesn't put profit first? But within the legal protections that Facebook has under Section 230, it can get away with this, knowing that it may cause more eating disorders and dysmorphia in young girls because it can generate more advertising. It will allow bitter forums to exist so that it creates more shares and more engagement. I think the algorithm is indeed important here because not one bit of this is transparent. It's like the Netflix show Squid Game, which I just began watching. You're all part of this massive game, but you have no idea who is behind it and how they pit people against each other. And they gleefully prey on our most base instincts and survival. In many ways, it reminds me of communism, the way Mao sowed internal discord and advocated violence. To some degree, that's what Facebook is doing, and perhaps intentionally. There's also zero transparency in terms of the subjectivity of promoting some content and disfavoring others. Let's use political speech as an example. Facebook affiliates heavily donated in favor of Joe Biden in the 2020 election. It is no secret that the organization leans heavily left. That means that in everything they do, there is bias, especially in how they moderate content. This is also the blind bias of most mainstream media. Facebook will claim that they bolstered their election integrity, but do we presume that every person on that staff is agnostic when it comes to political bias? Of course not. Think of the Russian collusion story propagated by Hillary and the DNC. That was all over Facebook. But it was also all over many media outlets that Facebook hosts. I think about Facebook restricting the spread of the Hunter Biden Burisma story from the New York Post, where Facebook intentionally reduced its spread, even though it claims that the platform is not an arbiter of the truth. Oh, but they pulled a big 180 on that, especially in the vaccine era. Just by me saying that word, vaccine, there is a high probability that audio scanners will catch it and place a link below this video linking to the CDC, which has been wrong time after time. That's how technical this has become. Remember that with the pandemic and a lack of in-person contact, we relied heavily on online communication. Facebook perhaps may be the most widespread forum for political conversation, as Twitter can be limited by characters. So is Frances Haugen being altruistic in her whistleblowing? Perhaps, and I certainly hope so. She certainly sheds light on an area that I think is universal, in that children are being targeted by and profited from, which affects their mental health and well-being. She had some suggestions regarding Section 230. Here's what she testified, quote, "If we had an appropriate oversight, or if we reformed Section 230 to make Facebook responsible for the consequences of their intentional ranking decisions, I think that they would get rid of engagement-based ranking. Because it is causing teenagers to be exposed to more anorexia content, it is pulling families apart, and in places like Ethiopia, it's literally fanning ethnic violence," unquote. She claims that Facebook wants you to believe in a binary choice between a platform filled with extremism and division or a total lack of free speech. She says that's a false choice. But I think we have to really think about this because there's a delicate balance between free speech and, well, let's say, preferred speech. The lack of transparency means that both militant Islamic extremists and a mom who is fighting for her child's medical freedom and choice could be treated the same as terrorists. If you look at what Attorney General Merrick Garland is doing with the FBI in looking at parents at school board meetings as potential terrorists, think of what that might look like in the online world. Would parents' legitimate anger at school board meetings be suppressed online? Would it become unshareable based on this DOJ decision? Would any Trump supporter be banned or shadow banned? We can never really know because we cannot see the algorithm. But to play devil's advocate, what business does the government have in regulating a private business? I've heard that argument as well. Facebook can create its own terms of service and deem whatever content it finds good or bad. Why involve the government? Republicans usually are in favor of deregulation. The internet and Facebook also created a forum for us to share so much about ourselves and our lives that Facebook is studying us with a microscope to advertise to us. But inadvertently, it's collecting data and our voting habits, our likes and our dislikes. We are voluntarily giving all this information up to them for the sake of having a social community. You could just say, well, get off of all social media. And honestly, I wish that I could. I think life would be experienced much more richly. We are allowing social media to affect our moods and choices, and we just willingly give up all this information about ourselves, and in turn, we tribally speak with those who agree with us and think like us, and then we go attack those who don't. And then think about just the psychology of our dependence upon these platforms. Every young influencer and many adults even freaked out about this outage for just a small 5 hours. I loved it being gone for 5 hours. I didn't have to worry about it or think about it. I can understand, though, why some businesses would be upset if they couldn't fulfill orders or they lost profit. That makes sense to me. But the sheer psychological dependence the world has on Facebook shows just how influential it is. But we have allowed it to be that way. In many ways, everyone is to blame here. Congress for its lack of Section 230 revision, Facebook itself for greedily choosing profit over public good, and we ourselves for creating this monster. We can't act like we weren't complicit in this. It's true that Facebook may be bringing out the worst in us rather than, congratulating someone for their engagement or commenting on that adorable new baby photo. But what's taken its place are online battles. And I have a real issue with how misinformation will be judged. The major media companies like WashPo or New York Times or even NBC, ABC, etc., they get stories wrong a lot. I think about the recent false story of the border agent whipping the Haitian immigrants. That was propagated all over Facebook. It causes outrage and unnecessary outrage. Why was that not flagged? Facebook just assumed it to be true. But when it came to Hunter Biden, they balked. Just because Facebook might create a regulatory board, it's not as egalitarian or bipartisan as Congress is. It's certainly not agnostic. I think that Trump's suspension was proof of that. Haugen may have a point that having an outside regulatory body would be one way to approach it. But even then, how do we determine who sits on that body? The one thing that seems to be very clear is that Facebook needs to be far more transparent and needs to come clean on what it's doing. It could be doing far more damage than good, just like big tobacco and big pharma. If we can regulate them and hold them accountable, we should do the same with big tech. Having people that at least seem more respectable than the dorky disheveledness of Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, might also help too. I think this is a time for a fresh set of eyes and ideas, and maybe, just maybe, it can be bipartisan. You hate to see the government intrude on private business, but this area of technology and communication has gone AWOL. Their power is too great. They affect too much, and for that reason, we need to rein back their power. While Facebook whistleblowers have been ignored in the past, maybe Frances Haugen can be the tinderbox that actually starts the fire this time around. We have dilly-dallied far too long with respect to these big tech giants. I'd like to see the best Republican plan and the best Democrat plan put forward and go from there. I'm Beau, and that's the show.